there's so much knowledge out there, so much information, so many ways to get better. And we make so many mistakes. We're the product of our mistakes.
This is the current build that lets warriors top the meters in some circumstances, not all of them sadly, and these would be the runes you'd be using. You're probably also curious about the rotation. We're going to have to go into that a bit later because there are some conditions about when you actually utilize these different things. See, we don't heroic strike 24/7, it would take literally all your rage. There's other stuff we have to consider too, but let's quickly check out what the actual damage is. You can see here 743 DPS, and right now we're simming like we're on an early boss because we have the armor value set lower. You see this? Interesting. We only have homunculi on because, well, I don't really need to turn all these on to show you the differences between the specs, and quite likely your raid group doesn't have everything perfectly organized. Now we can see that if we were to instead go look at an arms build with all the same settings other than that the build is different, we'd actually have a reduced amount of DPS. Interesting. We're going to show you why you'd actually use both of these builds in one raid though in just a moment. Yet again, here is the talents. These are the runes. And finally, the rotation, which yet again, we will have to actually look at some of the settings and decide when you want to do this. Not the simplest thing ever. But quickly, let's up the armor. Of course, this is going to hammer our DPS. We're going from 700 to 500 here with the two-handed specs. Let's see what happens if we were to do the same thing with this dual wield spec. Now we're going from 750 to 450. Interesting. So before, the dual wield was superior, but right now you can see that the two-handed spec is superior. Let's dig into that. I want to check out some logs. First, we're going to be looking at Grubbus in Gnomer. You'll notice here that we don't have it filtered by the class. Why? Because warriors are very dominant when armor is low. Let's check out what items these guys have. Look near the bottom of your screen when this box pops up. You're going to see Mechatork's Arcano Shredder. This is the two bis weapons. Notice how few of these guys actually have them, but they all are using two weapons. So Iraqi has the bis weapons. The number 4th guy does not have the bis main hand. Alando does not have the bis main hand. The second guy has the bis weapons, and the top guy does not have the bis main hand. I personally think this is awesome. It means that the gear doesn't totally lock you out. But let's go check out what's going on with the final bosses, the ones where arms is apparently better due to the armor being higher. That would be these logs. Unfortunately for us, we do have to filter it by warrior. We're not allowed to be in the best in every position anymore. Now let's zoom out a bit. This is what it would look like if we didn't filter by warrior, but let's get back to our boys and we'll see what specs are they doing. Are they all going two-handed arms, or are there some people going dual wield fury? Checking out, I have no idea how to say this name. He is two-handed. The number 4th guy, Edition, you'll notice him actually from over here. And you'll also notice that the raid was on February 28th in both of these cases. But yeah, he's number 4 in both. He actually stayed the same spec throughout the raid. Number 3 is a two-handed spec, number 2 is a two-handed spec, and number 1 is also a two-handed spec. So what we can see so far here is fights with higher armor benefit from you going arms. I think likely this is due to deep wounds being less impacted than literally all your other damage sources by armor, but that's kind of speculation. Let's go look at how we could modify some settings in the sim to see, are there other ways to do a lot of DPS? Could we potentially simplify the rotations? You can see right now you'd have to actually pay attention to what your rage is, and there's a certain threshold where you wouldn't want to actually swap if you have more than this. It could be a DPS loss. Same thing with using Heroic Strike. If you were to use it just literally all the time, it would absolutely hammer your damage because it would just consume all of your rage. In my opinion, less is best when it's possible. Instead, we can swap a rotation to be real dummy-proof like this. We still have a conditional. It's when you get Blood Surge, you have to actually use your slam at that point, and not at any other times. We can see that this actually sims pretty good, which is nice. It sims about as good as a dual-wield Fury would if you had a high armor boss fight. There's nothing really too fancy here. I'm basically just showing you that you can, in fact, use swords. We're actually simming this with the Gizmotron sword that's off the Crowd Pummeler boss, and these would be the runes we're using. who cares about the feat runes? The only thing that's really interesting here is that instead of having Frenzied Assault, which is the standard, we have Consumed by Rage. Let's watch how this is actually going to lower our DPS if we put Frenzied Assault on. Now, why would that? It's just because since we have this simplified rotation, we actually sit at very high rage at all times, whereas if you use the meta rotation, you'll instead have all these abilities, and it's going to make it so you don't sit at super high rage all the time. So let's see what happens when we take the meta build and we swap it to Consumed by Rage. You're going to notice that's going to go down in DPS. Instead of it being 500 still, it's now 430. Interesting. So if you have this complicated rotation, you're rewarded for having Frenzied Assault. Cool. And if you have this more simplified rotation, it's the opposite, where your DPS actually goes up when you switch from having Frenzied Assault to Consumed by Rage. Remember, this is still not really a DPS increase. It's just that I'm showing you that you can have a very, very minor DPS decrease. And you no longer need to get weapons that are as hard to get, because this other sim that we're looking at uses gear that's, in my opinion, more difficult. Check this out. Let's see. What are they summing with? Thermoplugs Rocket Cleaver. I believe that this is quite a bit easier to acquire than if instead you wanted to go for the sword, simply because a lot of people just don't think the sword is as good. But that is a little bit of a matter of opinion. They do have similar drop rates after all. Now, what's another build that's a little bit interesting? This is one using the Lumbering Ogre Axe. I basically just want to show you that you don't really need that killer of gear to be able to do something reasonable. And also what's kind of funny about this is if you had a Pendulum of Doom instead, this would do like as much DPS as the meta build anyways. But if I simmed this with the Pendulum of Real World Trading, that would make me kind of a jerk. So instead we're going with a green, which you can almost definitely get your hands on. What are we doing here? Well, it's actually exactly the same as the other build. Yep, that's right. We don't make any decisions. We just wait for the Blood Surge shit to proc, and then we send it. Nice and easy, and we'll run the sim again so you can see that. Same deal here, though. Remember, the build is basically the same. We're just swapping points from this sword spec into axe spec. But now for the one that's more interesting, and this is going to be a little bit about how to have fun with the sim, how to try to think about what kind of stuff would change the way your damage goes out. Now, in this case, let's see what's going on. We can see that we're getting 488 DPS, and we're using some kind of a two-handed build. But how did we get here, and why does this look so different? Look at our rotation. So we're down 12 DPS, we're only using 4 abilities. The meta build instead looks like this, which uses basically twice as many abilities. How did we only lose a little bit of damage? Well, let's think how you'd experiment to find the best way to play if you wanted to play a little dumb. Let's change this to function the exact same as the way the meta builds did before, and then resim it. We should be able to get this to, say, 500 DPS, and then we're going to work in reverse. And we're right back to where we started with the meta build on dealing 500 DPS. Now let's work in reverse and see, can we get this number to be just a little lower, but maybe make our rotation much simpler? What's the first thing you might be thinking of if you wanted to make it so you could do more damage? You might want to try swapping your runes. So what happens if you go to Consume by Rage, but you leave everything else the same? Let's sim this again. It looks like we lost about 28 DPS. I kind of wonder why. Let's check the statistics panel down here, and then we can check out how often is Consumed by Rage actually up. You might not notice it yet, but now hopefully you do. It's up a third of the time. I wonder, can we get that up? Could we maybe look at our rotation and come up with an idea why the uptime is so low? And you're going to quickly see that, yes, it's very easy to see why it's so low. Looking at the rotation up here, currently you have it so you're going to do a Heroic Strike whenever you're over 90 rage, and you're going to overpower basically when it comes up, because the only time you won't stand stance for it is if you have 90 rage. Hamstring's going to be your filler move. You're going to use Execute when you get a chance. This will make you drop your Consumed by Rage quite often. It depends. And then we have Whirlwind here, which using that on CD, Mortal Strike on CD, and of course, we're using Slam on CD also. We actually have precise timing right now. Cool stuff. We could have tried something like Blood Surge, but that wouldn't really work because then we'd need to have Quick Strike, and the meta build didn't have that. Now, what would happen if we tried to use less rage? I imagine that the reason that we don't have Consumed by Rage up is that we're rage starved. So let's take off Overpower and Heroic Strike and see, can we actually increase our DPS? And we did. It went from 470 to nearly 480. Remember, before the Consumed by Rage uptime was 35%. Let's see what it is now. It's almost doubled. That's really cool. But you got to be careful when you're trying to experiment like this. It's really easy to lead yourself astray and not decide to go deeper. What would instead happen if we enabled one of these? Let's put Overpower back on. This would make our DPS a little bit lower. Okay, so most likely if we just disabled Heroic Strike, we'd see maybe we should try disabling some other things too. What if instead we tried the Heroic Strike idea first? So we put Heroic Strike on again, and then we take off Overpower. So the DPS actually went down. You see that? If we went from having the meta build on, which would be like this, we'd have 471. You might try to experiment by disabling Overpower first. And if you did that, you'd actually notice that your DPS stays the same or goes down. Usually it will go down. This might make you think that this is a bad idea, but you have to try a lot of things. So you only really see that you gain this benefit when you do both of them. In fact, if you were going to do just one of them, what you'd probably notice, and this should give you a clue, is that you will actually have higher consumed by rage uptime, but the DPS is still lower. You can see how we just resimmed it with Heroic Strike enabled, but Overpower not. Consumed by rage goes from 35% to 50% uptime, yet your DPS actually goes down. Interesting stuff. So yeah, we'll get both of these off, and we'll see that now we're at almost 480 DPS. What other things should we try? Really, you should try everything you can possibly think of, but this is going to be a little more organized, that way we can get the video over with. Let's check execute. What if you turn this off? Would this make it so you can do more damage? Surprisingly, yes, let's see. And we do the sim again, and now we're at 487. Kind of interesting stuff. So what has changed here? Well, basically what we did is we only had to modify the rune here, going from Frenzied Assault over to Consumed by Rage, and then we turned a bunch of things off. We didn't really add anything in. So what you'd be doing is every 6 seconds, you'll do a slam, because you have the precise timing rune. And then, of course, you're going to use all these other abilities that are CDs just whenever they're up. Your filler is going to be Hamstring, which is fantastic because it can crit and it's going to provide plenty of damage with deep wounds. Look at how much of your DPS is deep wounds. This shit is absolutely hilarious. There's so many things you can figure out by digging into the logs and trying to come up with your own idea on how to play. I bet you a lot of people, if they were to try to play like this, with all of these buttons in their rotation, they would actually do less DPS than if they played this dummy spec. But of course, if you're going for the highest parses in the world, you should not play this dummy spec. You should do the meta, you should watch out what the guys are doing on Fight Club and at the top of the logs and copy them. But maybe you just want to screw around and have some fun. You can experiment with yourself and take things that are meta and slowly bastardize them and see, is this going to make it more fun for me, or maybe it's just something different? You just got to make sure that you dig pretty deep, because sometimes, like with the Heroic Strike and the Overpower thing, if you only change one setting at a time, it might not actually incrementally change your DPS in the way you think. And in case you haven't noticed it yet, with a rotation like this, where every single ability has a set CD and there are no activations, and then the only ability without a CD just has none, you could create a one-button macro and have a one-button warrior yet again. Interesting. Maybe we'll do that soon. And if any of you nerds are actually serious about trying any of this simming crap on your own and coming up with stuff, keep that idea in mind that if you piecemeal change stuff and look at the DPS, it can lead you astray. The reason why is because if you optimize your character that way, it's called a greedy algorithm. It can lead you astray. The problem needs to be super well defined for a greedy algorithm to not cause problems. If you want an example of this, check out something called Dijkstra's algorithm. I'll put how to spell that in the description, but basically it's how to get through a complex maze efficiently. It's kind of nuts.